Okay, so we start again with Mitchell Green's talk. So Mitch is from the University of Connecticut, and his talk is entitled, very difficult to pronounce for me, on the semanticization of force. Sorry.
Thanks very much.
It's yours.
Thank you, and thanks very much for the invitation to be part of this workshop. I'm honored and pleased to be here, and especially delighted to see life beginning to return to Europe as the pandemic breaks, at least so we hope. So, thank you. And like Eric, I would normally prefer to be able to answer questions for clarification as I go, but I don't think it'll work, so we'll just have to wait until after. All right, so for this talk, I'm just going to be examining the ideas from a recent publication by Peter Van Elswyk by way of seeing whether the project of trying to, as it were, domesticate illocutionary force in semantic terms is something that we can find compelling, workable, etc. Seems to me people who are from a more linguistics kind of bent are inclined to do that sort of thing, and I don't want to try to argue on a priori grounds or anything that project has to fail, but I think it's worth checking it out, kicking the tires as it were, and see how far the project can be taken, or at least seeing how promising it is. So that's what I'm about today. So I'll start out with just introducing the issue, talking about this notion of representing as, which makes some carries some weight in this theory, talking about Morean absurdity in the process. We'll be considering some evidence that Van Elswyk promotes in favor of the theory, talk about what the theory has to say about embedding considerations, compare the theory with the so-called performative hypothesis, and then I'll raise an objection to parentheticalism. Sorry about the not very pretty name, but it's not mine. And then I'll give a pragmatic alternative by way of, out of fairness, trying to put myself on the hot seat. So just by way of starting out, especially to make sure we're not talking past each other, I think of an assertion as a member of what I call the assertive family. Here's a picture of the Hatfields from the American West in the latter part of the 19th century. Now that's an assertive family. And I want you to think about the same thing when we talk about assertion as being a member of a family. It's got other members such as conjectures and guesses, what you might call swear-to-gods and predictions and the like. Those are all other members of the assertive family. So it's not the case that just an indicative sentence is an assertion, or even an indicative sentence put forth with speaker meaning. That's not an assertion either, in the way that I'm going to be using that notion. And you can see the distinctions that I want to draw by noting that each of these is associated with distinctive norms, and probably with different sets of intentions. If you're an intentionalist like I more or less am, that should be fairly clear. Something that I think most writers and people who theorize about language and on the speech act side of things would probably agree, I guess, is that assertion is associated with representation of knowledge. So here's one way of putting it. One who asserts that P represents herself as knowing that P. I've not, I think, seen many people who come out and just plain doubt that. And I guess I think that's pretty plausible. And this is normally explained in pragmatic terms. That is to say, here's an image from Van Elswyk's article. We're going to start out with the assertoric act. We're going to break it up into the locutionary side and an illocutionary side. The locutionary side is going to be expressing a proposition. We've got plenty of doubters about that picture. I'll get back to that in a moment. But the illocutionary side is going to be a matter of representing the speaker as knowing, and on one relatively well-known way of understanding where the representing the speaker as knowing story comes from, it's from uttering a sentence with a certain set of intentions. So that's the division of labor that Van Elswyk wants to consider and then try to offer a better alternative to. We can jib at that a little bit if we want to, and notice that we can deny that the locutionary act we can deny that it only expresses a proposition. We might say, for example, that even declarative sentences are, in some sense, they do more than just express propositions. Maybe they do indicate illocutionary acts, to speak in the way that François would want to put it from his force cancellation paper, and that seems to me fine. I don't think those niceties need to distract us here for purposes of assessing this project. So I'll leave that aside after just noting it. So here's the beginnings of a sort of semantic alternative to understanding how you might explain the fact that one who asserts something represents herself as knowing the thing that she asserts. You might hold that declarative sentences somehow conventionally encode their role in being used to represent their speaker as knowing their content. That something in the conventional meaning of the declarative sentence does the job of representing the speaker as knowing what she asserts. And Van Elswyk, in this paper, Phil Review, just coming out, it's out or recently out, I can't remember, has the view that I'll develop a little bit further, but the essential idea is what he calls parentheticalism, that each unmodified declarative sentence contains a covert parenthetical, I know, that does precisely that, where unmodified, the covert is going to mean zero expressed in the same sense in which we might say, if a person says, he said it was raining, the that clause is zero expressed, but there in the, as what used to be called the logical form of the sentence. Likewise, Van Elswyk will say that unmodified means there's no lexical stuff inside the sentence that, other than I know, of course, that serves to modify the sentence. So that'll be things like I believe, or apparently, or probably, or according to Bob. He'll use this hypothesis to explain what it takes to be a precisification of assertion as knowledge representation. I feel like I skipped a slide somewhere along the way. I don't know what happened to it. Anyway, my acronym for assertion as knowledge representation is AAKR, so if you use that in a moment, you'll know what that refers to. But he's going to precisify AAKR, assertion as knowledge representation, as KRE, what he calls the knowledge representation effect, which characterizes as this. For a speaker S, an unqualified declarative D expressing proposition P in context C, S's use of D in C represents S as knowing P in C. Let me unpack that a little bit. Unqualified means that D, in his words, contains no epistemic vocabulary that hedges or conditions how a proposition is expressed. So the qualification, if there is any, is always going to have to be in lexical terms. Its knowing, I think, would be an example of such a hedging or conditioning. But neither conversational context, intonation, accompanying facial expression, nor prosody is included here in the account of what it is to qualify a declarative sentence. So this KRE, knowledge representation effect, is going to be the core explanandum that he wants to try to develop a theory that will entail and therefore explain. And it's a precisification of assertion as knowledge representation. Let me talk a little bit now about this notion of representing as. Representing as seems to be a three-place relation of the form A represents B as being C, such as we find in the painting represents Churchill as a bulldog, or the map represents the landscape as being pretty rugged. So it's representing as does not essentially require that the representer represents herself as being a certain way. That's just a special case. And not all uses of representing as clearly employ the third relatum. We might say things like the diagram represents the working of a transistor, but we could gloss that really as the diagram represents a transistor as working like this, and then you present someone with the diagram. I suppose you could do it that way. I don't think we need to get hung up on the question whether all uses of representing as are sort of at some deeper level a three-place relation, but I think it's a close enough approximation to the notion to talk in those terms for the most part. And the same logical structure carries over to verbal forms of representation. For example, if I say, in describing it as being full of landmines, you represented the landscape as being treacherous. So that verbal form of representation still gives that three-place relation way of talking. And representation as, notice, is no proof of any kind of strong commitment. Assertions, vows, signed contracts, promises all involve strong commitments, often incurring moral and legal jeopardy. But my drawing of Churchill as bulldog, or wearing a costume to a party, a costume party, for example, involve representation as without strong commitment. So notice that representing myself as being thus and so does not involve any kind of strong commitment, anything like the way in which a promise involves a strong commitment, or a vow, or a signed contract. Maybe they involve weak commitment. For example, you can criticize my drawing as bad, inapt, etc., and you could criticize my costume as in bad taste, or an example of cultural appropriation or something like that. But again, even then, even if my behavior is criticizable, it doesn't involve the same kind of commitment as if I had made a promise or signed a contract. So too for verbal self-representation. So if we're play acting because we're in group therapy or something like that, and I say, I'll be the recovering addict, I'm going to represent myself as being a recovering addict. But again, if someone comes up and says, but Mitch, you're not, I can still be playing the part. So verbally representing myself as being phi, even overtly, may entail weak, but is not sufficient for any kind of strong commitment. So if I were to give a gloss on representation as, it would be something like, A represents delta as being phi just in case A gives an indication that delta either has or is to be imagined to have property phi. And because it's got this disjunction between has or is to be imagined as having, that's where the possibility of relatively weak commitment comes in. So gives an indication, I should note, may need to be refined as something more like does something designed to indicate. So for example, the way Wayne Davis used the notion of indication, that's built in, it's got a notion of design to indicate. It's not always on the surface in the way he puts it, but I think it is there. I don't think we need to decide whether that's the right way of glossing, but that would be one thing I'd be open to. Either way, the crucial thing here is representing oneself as being phi does not involve a commitment to being phi of the sort that we associate with speech acts like assertions, vows, and promises. Same holds for representing myself as knowing. I draw a picture of myself looking at a dog. I therefore represent myself as knowing that there's a dog. But it's not very strong. So even if assertion entails knowledge representation, converse is not true. All right, part 3. More in absurdity and self-representation. Recall that it's generally, we've already talked about this today from others, generally agreed that there's something absurd about saying in all apparent seriousness, P, but I don't believe it. That's the omissive Morian case. Or I believe that not P, but P. That's the commissive Morian case. Omissive because I'm saying I don't believe. I'm indicating that I omit from believing this thing. And commissive because it involves an I believe, an avowal. Assume that we're going to, in order to make sense of how these things sound odd, we want to assume that neither case involves a mid-utterance change of mind or a change of perspective. And notice, however, that these are not semantic contradictions. Are you able to let that person in, or should I do it from here?
No, I'm not permitted. I don't know why.
I feel I have such incredible power. I hope they buy me a beer someday. These are not semantic contradictions. For example, we can easily imagine a case in which P is true, but I don't believe it. You can easily imagine a case in which I believe that not P, but P is nevertheless true. Yet there's something absurd about seriously uttering them. Notice that Moore himself distinguished between paradox and absurdity. So he said these cases, these utterances sound absurd. What he called a paradox was the fact that they sound absurd in spite of the fact that they don't involve a semantic contradiction. So when people talk about Moore's paradox and they talk about these cases, I think that's, at least historically, a little bit confusing. I'd rather reserve the word absurdity for, as it were, the odd sound of these types of sentences, and the word paradox for the difficulty that we have in understanding their oddity, given that they don't involve semantic contradictions. Van Elswyk wants to focus on what you might call epistemic Moorean absurdity, the cases like P, but I don't know that, and I know that not P, but P. 4 is of course, a semantic contradiction. But 3 seems not to be. We readily imagine a situation in which P is true, but I fail to know that it is. However, Van Elswyk, his parentheticalism is going to say otherwise, because it glosses 3 as P I know, but I don't know that P. So he writes, my proposal is that discourses like, I'm changing the numbers here, 3, are defective because the proposition contributed by the hidden parenthetical, that's the I know bit, of a declarative in one segment of the discourse contradicts the proposition expressed by a declarative in another. That's a price to pay. I'm not sure it's a reductio of the position, but it is a commitment of his that you might scratch your head over. The idea is that 3 emerges as a semantic contradiction after all on his theory. Indeed, so does 1. P, I know, but I don't believe it. Semantic contradiction 2. Assuming that we all agree that knowledge entails belief. So those are hard pills to swallow, but maybe they're not reductios. They certainly seem like prices to pay. All right. By way of evidence, positive evidence that he wants to provide in favor of parentheticalism, he's got a couple. So when we talk about what happens when somebody challenges assertions, somebody might challenge my assertion. I say interest rates will rise soon. A polite, relatively polite challenge might be, how do you know that? But notice, I didn't explicitly say that I knew it, but the intelligibility of a reply of the form, how do you know that, could be accounted for by the hypothesis that on some deeper level I did say that I knew it. Likewise, when somebody in a perhaps more aggressive way says, you don't know that, again, the presupposition is that I am presenting myself as knowing. And one way to account for how it is that I present myself as knowing is that I say it, or at least there's an elliptical bit of elliptical parenthetical phrase in there, in the utterance. So either way, the respondent's taking the speaker to have indicated in some way that she is taking herself to know the expressed proposition to be true. And again, one way of accounting for that would be to put it in the semantics. Likewise, with so-called not at issue content, somebody says it's going to snow, I think. A felicitous response would be that's false. An infelicitous response would be you don't. So the idea, it's going to snow and I think are not on the same level discursively, so to speak, I think is understood on his view as not at issue content. It's somehow backgrounded. Likewise, if somebody says it's going to snow, I think, it's appropriate to reply, I don't think so. It's at least odd to reply, you don't. Maybe intelligible, but odd. And the not at issue content approach would account for that. Okay, so these are some data that I think the theory can make sense of. Likewise, embedding considerations and semantics. So think, I'm sure one wants to wonder what happens under embedding, but for conjunction, the situation is pretty straightforward. So we might say Robin is bald and Jordan is tall. Robin is, I think, bald and Jordan is tall. Robin is, I think, bald, Jordan is tall. I heard Robin is bald and Jordan is tall. I heard all those make perfect sense, and the parenthetical expressions occur in the way that you would expect them to occur. They embed in some sense of embed, and they have the semantic and pragmatic features that you'd expect. As he puts it, conjunction plays nicely with parentheticals in every which way. Whereas other embedding contexts are less accommodating. For example, disjunction, either Robin is bald, I know, or Jordan is tall, I know, seems very strange. Negation can only be understood as I know taking widest scope. So it's not the case that Robin is bald, I know. It doesn't seem like you can get the I know into the, within the scope of the negation. Conditionals only seem to make sense if we take the I know as having widest scope. So the one on the top doesn't seem to work. The one on the bottom is better, but it's only because we take I know to be covering the entire conditional. Attitude descriptions, George believes I know that Robin is bald, or the more nominal type, George has the idea I know that Robin is bald. Again, those seem to be ones in which the parenthetical expression takes wide scope. So to give a sort of diagram for these things, we'd say if you've got a conditional, if you have a parenthetical in the antecedent, it doesn't seem to be grammatical at all. The idea here is this, that the knowledge representation features of utterances track the grammatical constraints that English at least allows for when parentheticals can embed and where and when they can embed. So if you can get a parenthetical in the consequent, but it's understood as taking wide scope. Not in the antecedent, though. For conjunctions, all 6 of those boxes can be checked. Those are easy cases. For disjunctions, you only take wide scope when you have it over the first disjunct or the second, but doesn't seem to work for both. And for complements, verbal complements, they do embed, but they end up being heard as taking widest scope. All right, so then we've got 2 approaches. The one on the left is the one I talked about before. I'm not going to try to go into the use conditional meaning that Van Elswyk uses to explain how his theory works, but the idea is essentially this. All the work of the way in which an assertion represents the speaker as knowing what she asserts is done at the locutionary level. And that's captured not just by a truth conditional meaning on the left, the process of expressing a proposition, but also by the use conditional meaning on the right branch. And the idea is something like this, that on the analogy of an utterance of ouch, for example, on the Kaplan model of use conditional meaning, that is going to be one that makes an utterance felicitous if and only if the speaker of the context of utterance is in pain. And the idea here is that if you have an embedded parenthetical, the form I know, that utterance is going to be felicitous if and only if the speaker of the context of utterance knows the thing of which she speaks, knows whereof she speaks, as you're going to put it. Okay, so the labor here, the division of labor for Van Elswyk's theory is going to be all on the locutionary and essentially semantic side. That's why I call this a project involved in the semanticization of force. Different from the, I guess, sort of standard approach, the one on the left. Many of you will have your long-term memory activated, the performative hypothesis. You might be wondering how this relates to that, and I think Van Elswyk is right to say that this is in a better place than that theory. So his approach is reminiscent of the performative hypothesis, according to which every utterance with an illocutionary force has within its semantics some phrase that expresses that force semantically. Thus, if utterance of shut the door is an order and not just a locutionary act, it must be the case that a full semantic or grammatical analysis of that sentence will reveal that its content is really, I order you to shut the door. And likewise for promises and assertions and questions. Even an assertion will reveal an underlying I assert that. But first of all, I assert that P and P sure seem to have different truth conditions. And the performative hypothesis seems to send us on a regress, because if we now have uttered I assert that P, you want to ask, what is the force with which that sentence is being put forth? Is there going to be a performative prefix in front of it? And we're never going to end. So there are, I think, some fairly good reasons for being skeptical of the performative hypothesis, and it's been fairly worked over in the literature over the last, 40 years. It doesn't have a whole lot of buyers now, but, and there's another reason, even tokening an explicit performative is not sufficient on its own for an illocutionary act. I think you can see ways in which, sleepwalker, for example, is not going to perform an illocutionary act, even if it has an explicit performative. So you might wonder, if not a sleepwalker or a somnambulist, somebody's talking in their sleep, you might wonder what work the explicit performative would actually do. Just the tokening of an explicit performative sentence is not going to be sufficient for the performance of a speech act anyway. So it does, I think there's reason to think that adding a performative prefix to a sentence doesn't give it any power that it didn't already have. But parentheticalism has no need to posit a prefix before every sentence uttered with force. It leaves untouched the truth conditions of the, as it were, ad issue proposition. So we don't have a problem with the divergence in truth conditions between I promise to pay you €5 and I will pay you €5 or something of the sort, just because the parenthetical expression, as it were, just doesn't compose with the thing that it's connected to. And yeah, okay. So it seems to me the parenthetical view does do better than the performative hypothesis, and so if you reject the performative hypothesis, that's okay. You don't have to reject parentheticalism too. All right, but I do want to raise an objection to parentheticalism. There are many utterances of freestanding, unqualified declarative sentences that are not assertions. and that do not represent the speaker as knowing the content expressed. Think of these cases. We've got an astrobiology conference, maybe even here next week at the Collège de France, where it's understood, because of the nature of astrobiology, it's understood that all of our utterances are conjectures. So somebody says, comes up to this podium and says, Europa hosts single-celled organisms. There had better not be any hidden I know, parenthetical. Or if there's a game show where a contestant has to make a sheer guess, she might say the prize is behind door number 1. Certainly it's going to be false to the facts to understand her as having an utterance that harbors a hidden parenthetical I know. Irony, a waiter spills the gazpacho into my lap and I say that was graceful. I know. Stage utterance, alas, poor York, I knew him, Horatio. I'm not representing myself as knowing, nor does it seem plausible that I'm saying on any level that I know that I knew somebody named York. That is to say, remember, the knowledge representation effect said for a speaker S and an unqualified declarative D expressing proposition P in context S, S's use of D in C represents S as knowing that P. And that just doesn't seem true. That is to say, there just seem to be too many freestanding utterances, unqualified utterances, that are not assertions, and accordingly, not ones in which I represent myself as knowing the thing that I'm saying. So it seems to me KRE is just not true, and parentheticalism entails KRE, so parentheticalism seems to be untrue as well. The argument's simple. Now, you might try to rescue. You might read the foregoing cases as, we've got the flexibility that comes with the idea of the ternary relation of representing as. So maybe we should see them as, Europa contains life, I conjecture, where the I conjecture perhaps is a hidden parenthetical. Or the prize is behind door number 1, I guess, and I knew York. Hamlet knows. That is, as an actor, I'm representing Hamlet as knowing, representing something about the epistemic state of the character that I'm portraying. Sounds odd. Is it ungrammatical? I don't think so. I think we can probably make sense of it in the way that we can convince ourselves that even a sentence like "he saw herself" is grammatical. I think that's grammatical. That was graceful, I deny, maybe is what accounts for irony, the ironic case. So you might try to liberalize KRE along the following lines. This is going to be a little bit ugly, but I'll do my best. Representation effect is going to be for speaker S, an unqualified declarative D expressing proposition P in context C. S's use of D and C represents S or some S prime distinct from S as knowing P and C or conjecturing P and C, guessing P and C. Which of these is the case depends on I don't know what else to say, on context or speaker's intentions. This may be true, but it's going to provide no succor for someone attempting to domesticate illocutionary force in semantic terms. Because what's happening is going to depend on precisely the kinds of things that the person trying to go for the semantic account of force doesn't want to reach for, context and or intentions. For someone sympathetic with the notion of sentential force, there may be a sense in which an utterance of, that is, you might want to say, even these guesses and conjectures and things said on stage, even these utterances maybe they contain a covert parenthetical of the form I know. But if they do, it's no more robust than the picture of me looking at a dog. I don't see any reason why I couldn't say there's still a weak form of representing myself as knowing, but it doesn't seem to me to get the kind of oomph of assertion that I think both I and Ellsberg are trying to capture in the self-representation as knowledge kind of approach. Okay, so I've been sort of characterizing and criticizing. Out of fairness, I should spend a little bit of time talking about what I take to be a more positive alternative. I'm going to go back to essentially kind of discuss the first model, the first division of labor that I would espouse. Would be something like this. Van Elzer criticizes the pragmatic approach to assertion. Specifically, he criticizes it as given by Bach and Harnisch. We've already heard a quick story about the Bach-Harnisch account of assertion. and so I won't go back through it, but the idea is that Bach and Harnisch require reflexive communicative intentions in their account of asserting the P. I have to assert that P with the intention of bringing about a belief by means of my audience's recognition of their intention. That's going to be the fleshing out of the notion of expression that Bach and Harnisch make use of. But as Van Elzig points out, there are assertions made without such intentions. His example is, borrowing an example from Alston, perhaps the speaker does not have hearer-directed intentions because their job is to announce train departures in a busy station where people are rapidly coming and going. Which I'd say, I'm not sure that doesn't mean that means you don't have audience-directed intentions. They're just ephemeral. They're just short-lived for the people that are happening to come through the station. But it doesn't matter. We don't have to quibble about that, because I want to say this is surprising that he's not considering other options. There are plenty of accounts of speaker meaning and of assertion that eschew audience-directed intentions. For example, Wayne Davis and myself have developed theories of precisely that sort. So if your main gripe about the pragmatic approach is to understanding the knowledge representation phenomenon is that those require audience-directed intentions, I would say I've got a solution for you. It's not hard. And just to say a little bit more about the sort of positive account that I would want to give of knowledge representation is something like this. I think of assertions as designed to show knowledge. I'll unpack that a little bit. I see assertion as a social practice that's a product of cultural evolution, for better or worse. Like many other such practices, it has a role to play in social life, but that doesn't, I should clarify, that doesn't mean that it always will play that role, and nor does it mean that it's the best tool we could have designed for the job that it plays. But it does have a role to play. It does do a kind of job. One main role for assertion, as I see it, is to safeguard the reliable transfer of information. And it does that in large part by being subject to norms. That helps to explain how in asserting P, I perform an act designed to show my knowledge that P. Notice that show is a success verb. So if I'm doing something designed to show my knowledge, and if the design features of the situation that I'm employing do their job, then I make my knowledge literally available to you. But because knowledge itself is a success verb, I'm going to give you knowledge about the world as well. So it means that this idea of assertions as designed to show knowledge is important for me. Unpacking it is part of the story I'd want to tell as my account of how it is that someone who asserts represents herself as knowing. I'm not exactly going through analysis of representation of myself as knowing, but this is a slightly different formulation, but I think gets us essentially to the same end result. So that'd be, the idea is here, this account would be one way of representing myself as knowing. And I should just end with the idea that not all artifacts designed for jobs perform those jobs optimally, and some users of artifacts abuse them for their purposes. So it's consistent with what I'm saying, that there are non-vigilant epistemic communities in which there's a lot of bullshit, and which people might try to, but not manage to be able to show their knowledge when they make assertions. It just depends upon what sort of standards we have in place. So if we have assertions in a community in which somebody's making a claim carries with it a lot of responsibility and a lot of potential for loss of reputation, for example, then I would say that's the kind of ecology in which assertions can show one's knowledge. But there can be ways in which the ecology can be degraded, the community can be corroded when there are a lot of people who go around making claims that they can't quite back up, in which case, even if assertion is a tool at the type level, at the institutional level, that is there for a certain purpose, it can still be the case that a lot of individual assertions don't succeed in showing knowledge, even if the person who makes the assertion does know whereof she speaks. If she's not in a community in which people can be more or less, their words can be more or less taken at face value, then she might be a victim of that and be unable to show her knowledge by means of making assertions. So this is a slightly different, or I guess importantly different notion. It does depend upon intentions, but it also depends upon the idea of thinking of assertion as a social practice, as a kind of cultural artifact that we make use of, and when things go well, does a certain job for us. And that's what I have. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks, Mitch.
Thank you.
Nice talk. So I can't resist asking you what you think this kind of arguments that you used, how my version of the self-representational account, because I think it is a version of that would fare with regard to that. Now, it seems to me that always the condition of adequacy on a response to Moore's paradox is also to show how are these things different. Yeah, so not only in which you have to show at the same time how they conflict, but also how they're different in terms of how they represent the knowledge. Yeah, so, and I think that's a problem with the Van Elswyk account, I think, that you brought out, because if you just say it's parenthetical, it's the same kind, and it seems a straight contradiction, so it doesn't really explain how that is different. So I was wondering, what do you think might a condition of success, or might it be promising to think of in terms of different formats of representation, like I was suggesting, non-conceptual versus conceptual, or something like that, or suppose you have conceptually a directive, and you give a different signal, or just with a pointing gesture or something like that, and so this is not ordinarily thought of as a contradiction, but it's something. So I think this might be on the right track in this regard, or might do better than the Van Elswyk. So this is a general question, and I wanted to add one comment, because it seems to me that these other kinds of objections you used, there was a slide where you talk about irony and things like that. I don't remember all the exact points that you give, but it seems to me one might want to resist it by saying, yeah, even ironically, I kind of do present myself as knowing. Okay. I ironically present myself as knowing, so I'm not serious. And I think this would especially be strengthened again if you think of the contrast to the practical or something like that. So there's a difference between non-seriously, ironically asserting versus directing, and so you could say there's still some difference here that has to be represented, and that has to be represented by the force indicator, even if then the whole thing is ironically performed, so that you're not committed to it.
I think I followed most of what you said, but I don't think I followed all of it. And part of my problem was that my jet lag was hitting me particularly hard when you were talking about some of your, you're thinking about the idea of knowledge, representing oneself as knowing, so I might have to ask you to reiterate some of that. But I have no objection to the idea of some of illocutionary force as being somehow non-conceptually realized. I mean, I don't feel any great need to posit anything like a force indicator. It's one thing, it seems to be one thing to say that we have ways of letting others know the force with which we're making utterances. Not sure it follows that there is an indicator that we're using to make that possible. In some cases, I think we do, but I'm not sure. I'm worried a little bit about positing a notion of a force indicator as something, if it's not lexically realized, if it's not conceptually articulated, it's not quite clear to me what role it has, over and above our ability to make our intentions clear to our interlocutors. If that's what's going on, if that's sufficient for being a force indicator, then I'm cool with it. But I'm just a little bit wary of positing more than that for at least some cases. Of course, as I say, there are such things as explicit force indicators, but I'm not sure they're always there just by virtue of the fact that I was able to make you understand the force with which I was speaking. It doesn't follow from the fact that you understood the force with which I uttered what I did. It doesn't follow from that therefore there was a force indicator that I employed that enabled you to do that. I don't think that follows.
But wouldn't it be odd if there weren't? I mean, it's such an important thing that the force be specified. Wouldn't it be surprising if it didn't exist?
I don't think so. I wouldn't find it surprising. I mean, we have all kinds of subtle and powerful ways of figuring out what one another are doing. And I don't see why there has to be a designated tool. It's one thing to say that there's an institution that we make use of, but it doesn't seem to me to follow that there has to be a tool that in some sense is realized in a properly interpreted utterance that has illocutionary force that enables that to happen. That seems to me a further step. It may be the end point of that step, the conclusion may be true, but I don't think it follows from the fact that we often, if perhaps usually, succeed in making our illocutionary intentions clear. So I'd want to go slowly there, I guess, is my point. About Morris paradox, I think you're right to say that there are kinds of absurdity that come along with things like, you know, I say thank you, or I'm so glad to see you, but I'm frowning, or something of the sort. I say, you know, yes, but I shake my head, things like that. Are those cases of Morris paradox more an absurdity? I'm not sure. I don't see any strong reason for putting them on one side of the line as opposed to another. They are strange. I'd want an account of them. But I guess, you know, I go back and forth on the question whether or not it should be somehow definitive of cases of moral absurdity that they're utterances that could be true. That's often said, but I feel like laying that down as a necessary condition would, for example, beg the question against, you know, Jane Heal's paper from 25 years ago on Morris paradox that argued precisely along Wittgensteinian lines that they are actually explicit, they are actually contradictions. So I kind of hesitate there. I'd myself rather, you know, put it gently, as it were, and see moral absurdity is not evincing, at least for most cases, some knowledge cases will be contradictions, is not evincing contradictions. But I'm going to shy away, I think, from going so far as to say, if your position entails that sentences that have moral absurdity are actually contradictions, and therefore your position's got to be wrong. That seems too harsh to me. But if you want to say a little more about how you would gloss the idea of assertion as representing oneself as knowing, then we could put that on the table as a third option between mine and Van Elswick's and try to think about its merits as well. Do you have a... I think I remember you saying that you think that that's true. Do you have a story about how that goes, I guess is my question, about how you would explain the assertion as knowledge representation fact, phenomenon, assuming that you agree that it is a fact.
I mean, I was just trying to appeal to the idea that there are the more basic ways, non-conceptual ways of representing this through intonation, contour, and such devices which are more holistic, and that it expresses a sense of knowing. And so if you have a lexical force indicator, that's a different representational format, and that's articulated in thought, and you are able to reflect on it, whereas the other system is part of like more of an automatic grammaticalized system where you have a sense and you automatically register whether you have this position, but you're not necessarily able to reflect on it. And that's why I'm thinking it may be promising to also explain how there is this difference between the lexical representation where you say I know and the non-lexical or in some way different representation where you just say the door is closed or something like that. So that was my thought, that this might, because that seems to me is the kind of like, in a way, these requirements that pull us into different directions. On the one hand, we want to say there must be some kind of conflict, so the same thing must be represented or not. On the other hand, it must be different, because if it's not different, then it's just a plain contradiction. So that was just a thought.
I think the challenge is to account for, in non-semantic terms, how it is that an asserter represents herself as knowing. I think we agree that that does happen. The question is how that goes. You said something like expresses a sense of knowledge. I'm not, and I think it's...
and I'm also tempted sometimes to introduce maybe another dimension, because I know you're also very interested in this idea of these things are more evolutionary basic and these things. So I think also in terms of the distinction between natural meaning and non-natural meaning, that this more like towards, I mean, I think there's probably no sharp dividing line, and it's a matter of degree, but it's more like towards the natural end of things, like how your intonation and how all these movements of thoughts that you make. So that's more towards the natural end of the spectrum. Yeah,
I mean, my story, which I didn't want to go into too much here, but I'll just give a little piece of it. I've got a notion of what I'd call organic meaning, that is really, in some fairly literal sense, between natural meaning and non-natural meaning. It's not factive, so it's not natural meaning, but it certainly does not require intentions. It can be the result of evolutionary design, for example. So, you know, if at least as I understand it, the best story currently available about human facial expression is correct, than unintentional scowls that are produced when you're angry, or in the way I'd put it, organically mean that you're angry. They're not speaker meant, but they're richer than natural meaning. And then in the last couple of years, I've developed that into a notion that I call verbal signaling, where verbal signaling is not illocuting. It's going to include things like intonation, contour, and prosody, and various other, and certain parts of speech, and certain expressions, including perhaps slurs. I don't think that story plays a crucial role in this account of assertion as knowledge representation, my sort of pragmatic account of assertion as knowledge representation. But it's certainly part of the larger structure I'd want to bring in to explain the various ways in which we manifest our states of mind, not all of which involve speech acts in the traditional Austinian sense. So I think we're probably working on similar territory on that. Just one very brief thing we talked about. I like your idea of, for the ironic case, the ironically presenting myself as knowing. That may well be right. But I don't know how someone like Van Elswyk is going to account for that, because what can he do? He's got a parenthetical I know. And unless he says, well, in some cases when you have the parenthetical I know, you're using that ironically. Now he's going to bring in some pragmatics. Yeah. I think there's no way around that. So if he's going to draw a pretty thick line between the semantic and the pragmatic stuff, he's going to have to, I think, stick with it if his theory is going to be explanatorily promising. But then he won't be able to help himself to that distinction, it seems to me. If you've got it in the semantics, it's just going to do its work regardless of what you want it to do and regardless of what you intend, it seems to me. So I think I have no reason to deny that when somebody says, nice job, when the waiter spills the gazpacho in your lap and so forth, maybe you are ironically presenting yourself as knowing. But it seems to me the following is true. When you ironically present yourself as knowing, you therefore don't present yourself as knowing. And therefore, that's going to break a connection with Van Elswyk's positive explanation, I think.
Yeah, that's like the paradox of negation, in a way. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So this again, the conflict between, so you present the assertion in order to reject it, to deny it.
Right.
Okay, but I should stop. Thank you.
Thank you. I can almost guess what you're going to say.
No, actually, I'm not sure you can.
Okay,
I'm
even
not
better.
going to care about those points, which you said we'll put aside. So, thanks for the talk.
Thank you.
Very much enjoyed it. I'm gonna make two very small interpretive points in defense of Van Elswyk, and then I'm going to try to ask a broader question, which maybe connects to more of the rest of the stuff. So I think the point where you say, on his view, this counts as a semantic contradiction. I think there's a sense in which he's absolutely committed to this and there's no way around it. Mm-hmm. And he regards it as a feature rather than a bug. And then
a feature of what?
Feature rather than a bug. Uh-huh. And then there's the sense in which he would say, this is not a semantic contradiction, because normally when we talk about semantic contradictions, we're talking about contradictions within the at-issue content. And of course, he doesn't have a contradiction within the at-issue content. Right. He has a contradiction between the at-issue and non-at-issue, but that's exactly what he wants. I mean, there's no other way of giving a semantic explanation. So he's not going to, I don't think he's going to be or should be moved, right? So like in the performative hypothesis, you would maybe get a contradiction at the at-issue content, and that would be a problem. The exact way in which parentheticalism is supposed to help is to move that to the non-at-issue content. Mm-hmm. So it counts as semantic contradiction in the sense that the meaning is contradictory, but that's his explanation of absurdity. So like that's a feature rather than a bug.
Yeah. Can I respond to that? Because I won't remember that by the time I get to your second point. Right. I guess part of what's sticking with me is the idea of construing parentheticals across the board as not at issue. And I'm not sure if I think that that's true. I mean, for example, if I say, John, who is bald, is not bald. I think I've contradicted myself. And yet the parenthetical would seem to be, non-restricted relative clause. Tannhauser would say a non-restricted relative clause is a piece of not-at-issue content. So it seems to me we can come up with easy cases in which you get somebody contradicting herself, by virtue of the interaction between what's in the parenthetical, allegedly not at issue, and something that's not. So I'm uncomfortable saying that if it's not at issue, therefore, it's off the table for the possibility of contradiction, self-contradiction.
No, but I mean, I guess I'm sort of saying, he has the contradiction built into it. Like, there's no way, that's his account.
Yeah.
And he just, the way in which it's supposed to be better than the performative hypothesis that's moved into the not at issue content. So, like, all I'm saying really is, like, he wouldn't be moved by that point at all. He would think, that's my theory. You've just described my theory. Like, when you say it's a coster reductio, he would be like, no, that's my theory.
Okay, no, but just to clarify, I said, some might think that this is a reductio of his theory, but
fair.
I'm holding back because I'm trying to be cool.
Yeah.
So, because that was my intuition too, that he would say it's so deeply built into the mechanism that you're coming close to begging the question if you stop there.
And then the other really small interpretive point is that at one point you sort of said, I want assertion to have more oomph. And he said, like, both me and Van Elswyk probably want, like, more than this weaker sense of commitment. But then, I mean, reading his paper as a whole, you might think all he really cares about, all he really takes a datum point is explaining the Moorean absurdity. And towards the end of the paper, he expresses with Capellan skepticism about the notion of assertion as a unified, interesting thing. And he just thinks, well, insofar as that datum is concerned, I'm going to give a semantic explanation. And insofar as there are some other things that somebody else might care about under the notion of assertion, I'm going to be silent on those. And so, I mean, there's a way of reading what he's saying in the sense that, like, he doesn't want any more oomph than this weak sense of commitment, and so he'd just be happy with this.
Maybe, but notice that among the data that he adduces in favor of the theory are not just the not-at-issue content cases, the conversational objections and so forth, but also normative considerations. It's kind of buried towards the end, but I think it's there. It seems to me that representing myself as knowing is a fairly heavy kind of act. I mean, I'm assuming that we're not, it's not, there's no question of whether or not we're debating assertion in the, mid-20th century logician sense of assertion. We're just putting its proposition on the line and a proof counted as asserting it. That seems to me to be, I don't have any objection to that way of talking, but that's not what this is about, it seems to me. The connection with knowledge is a strong one, and it makes it, I think, a fairly robust, got a fairly robust explanatory job.
I guess I sort of thought, if your data point is like Moorean absurdity, maybe this sort of relates to the, like, bigger question I wanted to ask, is, like, you might think, suppose that P, but you shouldn't reason from P is also, like, Moorean absurd, right? Or something like this. Right?
I do think that there's a kind of Moorean absurdity that you can come up with the supposition case. I've tried to say that.
Then his style of explanation would think, well, I'll put the right parenthetical in there or whatever.
Yeah.
But of course, like, in some very strong sense of commitment, you don't have that. But, like, it's just the weak sense that does the explaining. So,
right.
So like, I mean, maybe I read him in, like, after something much weaker.
Yeah, in Dreckian terms.
Well, no, not necessarily, but yeah. But here's a larger question, and it relates to your point about the weak and strong notion of commitment.
Yeah.
And maybe, like, how it relates to what the rest of us sort of talked about and what we care about. It seems to me like, so it came up yesterday when François asked this question, and he said, suppose is like neutral, non-committal. And I said, well, no, suppose is you suppose that P is true. So in this minimal sense of committal that I care about, it is committal.
I think there's more to it than that, but it's certainly part of that.
Well, yeah, I mean, the point is, suppose that P is not like you entertain the proposition
Agreed.
that P,
Agreed.
which is like totally neutral.
Supposing is an undertaking of a plan, usually with an epistemic aim.
That's why you can, like, you have suppose take that clause. And then, when I talk about locutionary acts, all I care about is this very weak sense of commitment, not the strong sense, right? And then I think, what Peter talks about when he thinks, or when we're talking about the force-content distinction in the context of, what explains representation, or like what gives truth conditions, it's also this weaker sense of commitment, right? The way in which, entertaining the proposition that P is different from even like suppose that be, or I guess that be, or, you know. So I was wondering whether like, how you would comment on that, because so it's the weak sense of commitment really is in some sense that it's the like very important thing, and the strong sense of commitment is, you know, also important, but like for further social elocutionary reasons or whatever. But like the weak sense is already like a big step beyond mere neutrality.
Yeah. Right. It's a good question. It seems to me that I don't have any objection to putting, first of all, identifying that weak sense of commitment, distinguishing it from the stronger, you know, contract signing and promise making types of things that we also do. As I said, I think we tend to ignore that weak sense when we, as philosophers at least, ignore the fact that some suppositions can be offensive, and some, you know, even entertainings can be, you know, somebody says, consider the following proposition, just, you know, entertain it. Somebody would say, I'm offended by the very thought, so don't do that, right? That does make sense. That is part of our practice, and I think we tend to ignore that as philosophers. So I don't want to sweep that under the rug. I guess where I'm seeing difficulty is how, if you restrict yourself to that way of talking, you have a way of understanding how you represent yourself as knowing anything. Because knowing looks like it's a robust relationship to the world, and it's not, I think, going to be carried by stuff at the locutionary level, or more precisely, it's not going to be something that we're going to succeed in representing ourselves as having by virtue of our locutionary act. So that's, I guess, where I'd worry about there being a break.
I guess I'd of course completely agree to that, right? So I wouldn't want to tie, for example, I don't think Peter wants to tie his notion of judgment as the thing that generates propositions in any way to knowing.
Right.
Or like, I don't want to tie my locutionary act of saying in any way to knowing.
Right, and you don't want to say the antecedent of a conditional when I utter it is something that I represent myself as knowing.
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Right.
So
that's where I'd want to sort of, I guess, dig in my heels and say, no, we need to at least pay some kind of attention and have as part of our, at least part of our explanatory field, this more robust
well, yeah, no,
locutionary
I mean, I
notion.
totally agree, but that happens at the locutionary level, so that's why I sort of said that, like, it's totally fair to say the strong commitment is, like, important, you know, and stuff like that. It's just, in some sense, like, I wanted you to discuss a little bit the idea that the weak commitment is still distinguished from complete neutrality in the Fregean sense.
Yeah, I agree with that.
In many ways, what we care about in these debates is just the mere weak commitment. Like, when we're not talking about the elocutionary act, but just, like, building propositions.
Yeah, right. I certainly think that a lot of understanding of either some version of the force content distinction or reasoned rejection thereof can be had just by focusing on the more narrow notion of illocutionary. You know, what Churchill and McConnell-Tournay would call, you know, sentential force. I think does more work than we philosophers of language, at least, tend to acknowledge. So I'm on board with you on that point. I think we shouldn't ignore that.
Thanks.
Right. And I think I agree with you that Searle et al. Kind of did us a disservice by brushing that under the rug.
I think there was another question. Sorry, Dilip.
Thanks for your talk. I basically agreed with almost everything you said. But as you were talking, I started to think that there was one argument maybe for Van Elswick's view. Although actually now I'm not sure if it's an argument for his view or just something puzzling. And so I'd be interested just to hear what you have to say about it. So the point you made about your main objection, or one of your objections, was about conjectures and guesses. And that seems right to me. But one thing that is interesting, so sometimes people use these two things as diagnostics for when you have a genuine assertion as opposed to a conjecture or a guess, and also arguments for the knowledge norm. So one is the how do you know?
Yeah.
And the other is the Moorean, the epistemic Moore paradox. But one thing that's interesting is in these conjecture and guess contexts, they come apart because like if it's clear that we're in a conjecture context, or like suppose we're, I don't know, talking about you know, upcoming football match, and you ask me, who do you think is going to win? And I just say, I have no idea. I don't follow football at all. And you say, just guess, just tell me. And now I can say, oh, I think France is going to win. But I can also just say, okay, France is going to win.
Right.
And it's clear there. Now it would be weird for you to say, well, how do you know? Right? Because it's totally clear from the context that I wasn't representing myself as knowing.
Yep.
But I don't know if everyone will agree with this judgment, but it still seems like the Moore sentence is weird. Right? It still seems odd for me to say, in almost any context, to say France will win, but I don't know whether they'll win. And if you, so that seems like and maybe that's not the best case, but it seems like there are cases where these come apart, where you can't follow up an assertion by saying, how do you know? But the speaker still can't utter the Moorean sentence. And I was thinking maybe that's an argument, I'm not sure, for the Van Elswyk kind of view, because it does seem like there's something, that kind of suggests there's something about the sentence, the Moore sentences, that's bad, and it's not just some pragmatic thing.
And indeed, I mean, I think your suggestion is that if there's an utterance of an indicative sentence, that's going to generate the possibility of Moorean absurdity. I noticed that he does take a page from Wittgenstein's example of the, let's say, the jaundiced train announcer from, I can't remember, but anyway, the example is the train announcer. He says, train number 17 from Edinburgh coming in on track number 9 at 3:15. Personally, I think it's bullshit. Okay, sotto voce, right? That's Wittgenstein's example, and that seems like a case of not a case of Moorean absurdity. And the story that Van Elswyk tells about that is that the speaker is sort of switching allegiances mid-discourse, which seems to me not objectionable. But I mean, my point is just to note that even Peter would acknowledge that in this indicative case, you don't, what he calls extendability. That is, you could turn an utterance of an indicative sentence with an extended into a discourse with a denial of the appropriate kind of denial. Would it show Moorean absurdity? If that condition is met, then it's extendable. And his point is that for the train conductor example, it's not extendable. So he at least thinks that not all cases of utterance of indicative sentence are extendable. And I think he's right about that. And I guess I'd say I think that the conjecture or the sheer guess case, I mean, think about, game show, and, there's a huge prize behind one door and, a pile of dog food behind the other one. I have no idea, but I want to win. So I say, I don't know, door number 1. It's just different order, but it has the features of a Moore sentence, but it doesn't seem absurd at all. So I guess my pushback would be something like this, that if we focus, especially if we work hard to sort of get ourselves into the imaginary situation in which the utterance occurs, I think we can get rid of the seeming more paradoxicality or more absurdity of plenty of indicative sentences. And I think that Van Elswyk would agree with that.
Okay, just one comment on that. So one question would be, like, can you ever utter a sentence of the form, I know P, but I don't know P? Okay. But a second issue is,
I think you can.
Okay, yeah. So no, I agree. So, but there's a second question, which is any situation in which an assertion can't be explicitly followed up by asking, how do you know? Like, are all of those situations one in which the Moore sentences are okay? I mean, that's just an open question. So if those two things come apart, I think it's a puzzle for what, for... Right.
So let me just make sure I understand your question. Your question is, are all extendable utterances, that's in his terminology, extendable utterances, also ones to which it's appropriate to respond, how do you know? Right?
Doesn't extendable mean...
Means you can get Moorean absurdity by following up that sentence with a discourse, but I don't believe it, or omissive or commissive. I take it that's your question. And I haven't sat down and thought about that hard with a cup of coffee and a pad of paper to try to figure out what happens. But I would conjecture, yes. I think that those two things do go together. And I guess that is reason for feeling, that's a sort of thing, I think of that as kind of like an independent test that suggests that assertions do represent me as knowing the thing that I assert. But I'd be at pains to say there's a big step between utterance of the utterance of an indicative sentence or declarative sentence and an assertion. And even something that's got the grammatical, maybe even intonational features of assertion need not be something that's got that force. But thank you for the questions. Appreciate it. And after I sit down with my pad of paper, I'll let you know if I find anything surprising or interesting.
Okay, I think we're out of time, but we should thank Mitchell once more.
Thank you. Thanks very much.